Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Lordrusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. I'm Zandy, I'll be your host. And this Parley is a Supergiant super review of Bastion. This is a series Lordrusty's been doing of little Parley style reviews of these games. From my perspective, it's a pretty casual review because I haven't played Bastion in a little while and we're not, it's just us talking about Bastion. But we're doing a little retrospective. And certainly Lordrusty, it seems like you replayed some of it and are reviewing it. So that'll be interesting to hear about, and I certainly have a lot of thoughts about Bastion as I played the Supergiant games in order as they came out, and I liked all of them when they came out. And so I do have a lot to say about Bastion. It left a big impression on me. I share a lot of the feelings you're about to say in this opening paragraph, so let's get into it. I think Bastion, Lordrusty begins, was the thing I was most nervous about going back to this list. I still have a lot of songs from its soundtrack in my Spotify rotation, and it was one of the first indie titles I played. It really pushed me toward trying more games with less budget through the, at the time, just emerging indie game scene on Xbox Marketplace. Mechanically, it's probably the weakest entry in the series for me, but the vibes are so strong that I think they carry the whole game. Same format as usual for this one. Non-spoiler section first, spoilers after, and anyone from the community is welcome to chip in. So far, this has been a solo one, though. I'm definitely in the same boat. This was, I think I played this later, like probably toward the end of high school, is that right? I don't exactly remember. But it left a big impression on me. I hadn't played a lot of variety of games at the time. I spent a lot of my early life focusing heavily on single games, feeling like when you put a lot of resources into that game, it's like you've kind of invested in it and you get a better experience without, having to start up into another game. But I definitely don't agree with that anymore. I would feel that's boring at the moment, but I understand why I liked it at the time. And this was one of the games that made me realize what I was missing out on by not playing a wider variety of stuff. It was well regarded at the time. I definitely admired that it was made by a small team. Nowadays, I almost consider a small team an advantage in a way, certainly from a game design perspective. I feel like that's largely an advantage, but from logistically making a game like this, obviously it's very difficult to do that with, they would often say 2.5 people, 3 people. Anyway, Lordrusty begins, I really like how the world building in this one feels. It becomes pretty clear quite early on that Caelondia is a colonialist country, and the game leans all the way in on this throughout the game without really beating you over the head with it. I think a lot of this went over my head playing as a teen, and I just like the steampunk or Renaissance aesthetics of it, but coming back to the game, it's something that's present for almost the whole game. I definitely remember that, having not played this for a long time. The fact that the narration doesn't slow down gameplay really lets it get away with dropping quite a lot of exposition without it feeling like a chore. The conceit of it being a story also feels great. It's a great framing device. Absolutely. The first thing that we would definitely have to talk about talking about Bastion is that it really uses writing effectively. I think this is a well-written game for what it's doing. It uses the form very well, talking over the combat, which is going to be quite brawly. You don't have an ultra complicated moveset or anything. They're not going to be breaking your mental load by describing what's going on. And it's atmospheric anyway. You don't need to hold on to every single detail as long as you get the gist of what's being communicated to you. It's a great idea to communicate that while the player is fighting. You can imagine later games like Hades, where a lot of people, I think, meshed more with the story and it's more clearly presented in a way, but it also stops gameplay. And that's a big complaint, actually, a lot of you have had about Hades. While I don't really mind, I definitely feel like there's a way you could make it so toward the end of a fight in Hades, the narration begins. Like when you click a boon from Zeus or whoever, the narration begins. Zeus is going to say a little blurb, and you don't have to wait till you go and click the boon for that to start. That could make it feel like it flows faster if you want it to, while making it about the same if you don't want it to. And I think that would be largely better or a very, very good options menu setting. But I don't think we're going to get that. So maybe moddable. Go figure. But yeah, also having it be framed as it's like you're doing the game is pretty linear. And so what you're doing as you walk forward and the ground is created around you, and the narration is saying, the kid kicked some serious ass, in this. I don't remember any of the parts of the plot at this point. that really adds a certain ambiance to it, playing around with the idea that it's going to be fairly linear for some sections, and therefore, you can feel like you're just sort of going through the motions. But having the narration creates this feeling as if you're more like acting out what's happening in the plot, which I think is more interesting, entertaining in a way. You're not doing a mechanically monotonous thing with no other entertainment. I think a lot of games really underestimate how bad that can feel and how kind of relatively easy it can be to fix it. If you make the player operate a game and they have to operate through, just walking through an environment, it can be really annoying to have to do that if there's no gameplay input required from the player or not much. But just having it be that there is a story being told while you do that is quite a different matter. How many times have we enjoyed just taking a walk and having a conversation with someone? So, yeah, I don't know. I think that was a really, really smart choice. And this is something that would work well for games that were much more complex or, graphically fleshed out, as well as it being a good choice for this game, which is lighter. Certainly they didn't have as many resources, but I don't think this is a good choice because the game is thin, is what I'm trying to say. I think that the game being what it is, focused on its strengths, this is just a great choice anyway. Something I'm going to come back to a lot in my discussion of Bastion is that I think you can see how the good parts of the game they've got the basics down very well. A narrative that Lordrusty and I are both going to have is this idea that for a first try, it's kind of impressive, like how well, let's just read literally that line. It's been a while since I've played Bastion, Lordrusty continues, and it's a pleasant surprise how much they got right first try. The difficulty modifiers feel way better here than in Transistor. The lower difficulty of the game in general made these feel more like optional knobs to tune the game to where I wanted it, rather than something I was gaming to get better progression. I had a few missions where I pushed through with a lot of gods active to get a feel, and then dialed back with a couple that felt fun for most of the rest of the game because I wanted to enjoy the story. Outside of a few clunky moments of non-enemy interactable explosives not playing along with the auto lock-on, combat was smooth too. It's obviously not as snappy as Hades, the kid has more of a weight to him than Zagreus, but I was expecting the game to feel older than it did. Indeed, I think it's something I remember very well is that it worked for what it was, and they took again the basics very well in hand. When we get into talking about the build system a little more, which I did refresh my memory on by looking up before this, because I really didn't remember that. The thing that I feel like they did well was focus on quality over quantity and not overwhelming the player being the guiding principle that makes a game fun, rather than worrying that they need to make like the most little modifiers or the most, different enemies or whatever. Make them good. Have the game be just good and don't worry about it being too much for the player. You can also, of course, see many systems that are in essentially all of the Supergiant games present already. You could argue that something like the spirits that you are basically like passive buffs that you set up, it's very similar to the Mirror of Night, or even more similar really to the tarot cards in Hades 2. And the difficulty modifiers, that's been in pretty much every Supergiant game. You can see a lot of them doing in a very solid form here. Looking back on the Bastion wiki, I was really impressed remembering, oh yeah, wow, they basically were doing that right from the start. Great. And a lot of the modifiers for the spirits, for example, passives for the player, are very, it's a big effect, and there's not too many slots for those. Things like, you'll get into it in a minute, Lordrusty, but, when you're below 33% health, everything crits, something like that. Or you get crit chance when you're at max health. There's one that's like that. Just impactful effects where you can give the player a lot of something, but maybe there's a bit of a conditional, and letting the player kind of build their own playstyle out of those. Definitely looking back through them, I do feel like balance is maybe a weaker point, and that's something that I don't remember liking about the original Bastion when I played through it. I did not experiment as much as I do now. You know what I mean? I was not the same person, so I didn't dig into those upgrades that much, but it really didn't feel that much like it was going to be a game that wanted me to experiment between things. You kind of talk about this a little. In terms of builds, Lordrusty says, I have real mixed feelings. Having to repeatedly swap out the tools I was enjoying mid-mission felt pretty bad for me, especially when doing so would remove a secret technique I'd picked because it was tied to the weapon that got replaced, as the game doesn't let you pick what gets swapped. There's definitely some wonkiness where new weapons without upgrades have to be exciting enough to compete with old weapons plus upgrades, meaning that by the time you reach the end of the game, there's low odds you're using your starting weapon. Once I got pistols and pike, I occasionally went back to machete and repeater from time to time, but once my upgrades had outscaled them, it felt pretty bad going backwards in the progression. In many ways, it feels like the build system, which is surprisingly interesting for how options light it is, was directly at odds with the action game formula of increasing power over time through gear upgrades. To me, what stands out about this is positive in a way. We go back 10 or 15 years, and we're looking at 10, maybe 10, 12 years, maybe 15 years. And we have a game that is understanding the basics of creating build system fulfillment, making a build fulfillment, and making mistakes only that most other games also make. Things like, as you say, I think that is a big conflict. This game wants you to get stronger options as you go, but also wants it to be fun to like build through individual weapons or like make combinations of spirits, liquors. And those two things are at odds. But a lot of games have those two things at odds, and yet I kind of had a pretty okay time. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Lordrusty, but it sounds like you're saying you liked some aspects of it, and I mean, for it to have had that conflict and for you to still have enjoyed those aspects is, in my opinion, a mark of quality to some extent. They focused on quality over quantity options, and they made robust enough options, different enough, distinct enough options that felt fun enough that you kind of want to try between them despite the fact that they're maybe not balanced as in the way they might be. Unlocking them in a set order is rough. This is a problem a lot of games have. When you unlock like a really cool weapon toward the end of the game and you don't really have that long to use it, and so it's kind of made overpowered, but then that means there's really no reason not to use it unless you just really, really don't want to use the new powerful thing. The player is being given a very strong carrot to use this thing, but they only get to use it for a little while. Yeah, but then if you don't unlock anything toward the end, are you gonna, mess up the player's motivations? This is a problem a lot of games have, and I think unlocking things in a different order or a more player-driven order is pretty much the solution the industry, certainly Supergiant, has settled on. But at the time, I mean, basically every game I can think of had this problem, and so I think they did a good job with where the industry was. I'm not going to penalize them for not inventing like better buildcraft systems when things weren't there. But it's true that I don't think this game, while I think it's good doing a good job with the basics, I don't remember, and having refreshed myself in the systems, I don't see any of them necessarily reinventing the wheel either. It's not like there's anything in this game that is like crazy ahead of its time. You know what I mean? They're just doing the basics well. In a way, almost more impressive. The fact that just making the game have solid framing, narration, tone, ambiance, and then systems that work as best as they can within their limitations made a good experience, I think is a testament to the fact that if you just do things well thought through as best you can, that can make a game better than a lot of other games, even if you don't do anything crazy or radical to overcome a limitation of a certain type of game design. I can definitely be a bit dramatic with this stuff when I talk about it. When we get into discussing game design, I talk about you should overhaul the entire concept of this whole kind of game to fix its fundamental problem. Like, you don't have to do that. You can definitely do it this way and have it be effective. So definitely, I agree. Impressive for the position they're in, but the game design as a whole does still have some fundamental flaws that a lot of build systems fall into. Lordrusty says the liquor system, the spirits, also felt like they had just enough there to make interesting decisions. Some clear standouts once I had access to Were Whiskey, auto crit at low HP, and Life Wine, brief invulnerability at 1 HP. I don't think I ever removed that combo, and a lot of my other choices became around building around that. Crit damage for options for the bush pike, the other liquor which increases armor, giving me a bigger buffer in the Were Whiskey zone, etc. Yeah, but even then, like, they gave us options. There are 20 spirits in the game, and there's enough combinations that it feels like you could come up with stuff on their own. I definitely think that, like a lot of smaller build systems, it's very difficult to not make some of the good enabler combinations a bit obvious, like the Were Whiskey Life Wine. As I was reading this parlay before even refreshing my memory on these build systems, I kind of remembered that a little too much, you know what I mean? It's quite possible I did the literal exact same thing when I played. The idea of the liquor that increases armor, giving you a bigger buffer, might be something I wouldn't have thought of at the time. I didn't have that perspective, but it makes total sense. 33% of your health is more health if you have more armor because you can take more damage with 33% of your health. So it makes sense. I don't really remember what healing or lifesteal options there are, but there were some, if I remember correctly. I definitely used those, what was there of those. And there are some options in here that are, they're the corrupted type of upgrade idea. So they give you a benefit and then there's some detriment or a restriction as well. It might be something like, you get more damage, but you have less max HP. Or just like the things we've described, you get auto crits, but you have to have 30% or less HP. You have more crit chance, but you have to get max HP, things like that. So they put in enough of those things where it feels like the build options are beefy. There are, multiple different things happening to your build, extreme effects when you pick only one or two upgrades. That's great, but definitely a little straightforward as well. This game doesn't have a lot of super convoluted modifiers in it. Some of the spirits will give you like an empowered state, or I think they call it a zealous state when you drink them, something like that. Sure, but it has the strength that it's straightforward. There's nothing super convoluted in here, as far as I'm aware. No system that works in a way contrary to what you'd think, but also not a lot to sink your teeth into. When you definitely could make this game like that. I could imagine something like 20 minutes till dawn, a real weapon crafty Vampire Survivors like experience. Having a build system like that while playing this game, you could go further with letting the player transform how weapons behave, and I think that could work in this game. I'm not saying it's bad that they didn't do that, just that it's a trade-off. It's definitely shooting for less as a build system, but I think it does what it is shooting for well, sure. Anyway, spoiler time. If you have listened through this and you don't want to be spoiled on the story of Bastion, I remember it poorly enough that I can't give you much of a warning beyond Lordrusty says spoiler time. So go play it if you're interested. And if you don't want spoilers, leave now. Here we go. Lordrusty says, I really like that the third act plays in basically a couple long missions rather than doing the loop of going back to the Bastion over and over to tinker. Getting to just stick with the build I had and just rip through enemies felt satisfying, but also kind of helped the theme of this being someone going on a bit of a violent rampage to achieve his goals. Swapping to the ram at the very end was also the only forced kit swap I cared for. A lot of the times you get a weapon pickup in the rest of the game, there's a sort of attempt to maintain continuity with your existing weapon choices, whereas the ram segment just saying, nope, this is in fact a set piece, this is what we're doing now, felt so much better. Yeah, they committed to it more, for sure. I remember that it's a very climactic moment of the game. I remember that very well. I agree, the idea that was better because they were willing to commit a little more. The other ones, you unlock a weapon and just get it. There is this feeling of I'm not sure that's worth it. It's fun to use it right away, but I don't know. I think the tension of when you unlock something and then you're eager to go back to base and try it out is fun and good, and you could leave that alone potentially. That's just me. But this was a case where I liked it. Again, they committed. While I like that the end of the game is very much about nukes and hard pivots from being a jolly survival in post-apocalypse game to being about the cycle of war and trying to achieve peace, I sure am glad that games have moved on from capital B, capital C, big choices to show how morally complex they are. The final choice of reverse everything or carry on actually feels pretty philosophical and interesting in a heavy-handed, 2012 game morality kind of way, but the do you carry on doing a big murder spree with the ram or carry a wounded man really tickled me. It's so much a product of its contemporaries in this regard and really shows just how far Supergiant came to reach Pyre, which, while it definitely has its big choice moments, they're subtler and accompanied by a lot of smaller, more personal choices along the way. For sure, I would say from a thematic perspective of the Supergiant games, Bastion, Transistor, we'll get back to it, Pyre, have a kind of fixation on society a little bit that Hades largely abandons. That they're kind of doing, I'm not saying that's bad, they're just doing something else, which is great. Bastion and Pyre then compare ways of looking at a society. We're apart from the society, either because it's destroyed in Bastion or because in Empire you've been exiled. And we have some, yeah, capital B, capital C, big choices moments where we have to, kind of think about the morality of living in this world. Do you send people back? Do you keep the cycle going? That kind of thing. And there's a lot of self-sacrifice that I feel like doesn't totally land. It reminds me a lot of other parlay we've done about decisions feeling really impactful, where if it's the very end of the game and you just click a line of text and then you're told something transpires, it can really undercut itself a bit. It's already a pretty melodramatic choice. You alone can define the entire future of the world this way. But at the same time, the game, you won't see any of it and there are no consequences and the game is over. It's like, certainly Transistor has a little bit of that too. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's still interesting that they at least made it be that you act out those experiences. You know what I mean? I think a criticism I have of Transistor is that it doesn't feel like you had a lot to do with the thing happening in the setting of Transistor. Whereas in Bastion and Pyre, you're directly taking part in the democracy, as it were, as it's not. And therefore at the end, while you might not see the consequences of your decision as per se, beyond some dialogue and beautiful vistas, you still feel like you participated in the events that you are now choosing a conclusion for. And I definitely think that works a little better given the limitations. It is what it is. So yeah, I don't know. I would agree that there's kind of a tone shift thing that happens. You're kind of alluding to Lordrusty, where the game goes in a bit of a direction of, well, now you're deciding on this serious, more broad moral quandary rather than it being a story about human emotions. It's not like the end isn't emotional, I guess, but um I do like that they give you the RAM and then it's like, well, you can continue going on your killing spree. You've been given the tool and you're forced to use it in that set piece scene. And so now you know what it would be like. If we're not going to have the player enact the consequences of their decision, at least showing them what they would be prior in the game is good. And they do that. That's good. So maybe we're being a bit greedy. They did well for what was there. Um, yeah, I do think and also having it be that you really carry people. There's a very iconic scene where you carry a wounded man back through oncoming attacks that, while a little bit cheesy, still hammers home that you kind of feel that you're sacrificing something. Something that I liked is that whenever these games give you a sound and visual cue for getting hit, they can then use that, play that, to make it feel like something has hurt you, even if your character doesn't take damage. While you're playing, you get hit by an enemy, you make a mistake, you might die, and there's a little, conditioning thing that happens where your brain flinches a little when you hear the sound for getting damaged, when you see the flash on the screen or the rumble or whatever for getting damaged. And then if you use that sound again as you're, just in the story, walking through people who are attacking you as you go, uh, you can kind of feel it in a way you wouldn't otherwise. I think that can be a bit of a parlor trick. You've got to set it up with the narrative, but they made an effort to set it up with the narrative too. So personally, that was a memorable moment for me. I felt like I was convinced of some of the storytelling power of video games there. I think they did it well enough that it functions as a moment in the story. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a very proficiently made piece of game design, I feel. I feel like as a piece of storytelling, as a way of depicting what is happening in the world, what you do as the player, and you kind of seeing the consequences of your actions as much as you possibly can. I feel like they did a good job for what it is, but I don't know. I feel sort of torn about Bastion as well, like a little bit like Transistor. I definitely feel like there are elements where I want more out of the game. I understand that they're gonna want to ship the thing, but there are games where I feel like there's just so much in this small system, and you can do a lot with it and really fully explore its design space. And in a way, I kind of feel like we didn't get that with Bastion and to a lesser extent Transistor. In the Transistor review, I talked a lot about how I think that when I rated Transistor in my own list of games, in the spreadsheet, Transistor has an okay score, even though when I replayed Transistor, I thought the build system was surprisingly bad to use. The idea is very good. It's a great, inspired idea for a system, and I feel like they tried to fill out its design space. You get functions that are the things you'd think of: a chain function, an AoE function, a long range, a short range, a dash, summons, stuff like that. Not at all a bad result. And in Pyre, we get a really wide variety of like what is every single type of fantasy purgatory basketball character we can make, And the game made an effort to kind of exhaust those parameters. I don't want to be too greedy saying this, but to some extent, I think you can see how at a point you've got the system for the game. So you can program different ratios of and Pyre, a character's aura size and speed and etc. If you can get a 3D model for that character, you can program different combinations of those stats quite freely. You can fill out design space like that quite freely. And as a result, I feel like for what they are, the build system alone, the gameplay, it is what it is. In Transistor, I thought actually quite clunky. And in Pyre, yeah, I mean, it's just very particular, very snappy, but some people might just not like that gameplay. But the build system itself is quite fleshed out. I feel like here in Bastion, I feel a little bit different. I almost feel like the opposite. They did a pretty okay job, in my memory anyway, with making combat feel responsive. It seems like you felt that way too, Lordrusty. But the build system aims like bizarrely low compared to the other games in the series. I would argue in Hades too. It's a fairly ambitious build system. It's got plenty of new ways of applying ideas while getting the basics down pat. That's a thing they've done well in pretty much all of these games. Except Transistor's combat feel, in my opinion. But and it's interesting to see that this is a game where they kind of went the other way. I find myself less inclined to like less excited about Bastion simply because I feel like they reached for less. But you could argue that as a strict quality measure of the game, that makes it kind of better because they achieved what they set out to do. Transistor maybe feels less complete, but I can't help but praise the ideas. That's just me personally. I kind of want people to see Transistor more than I want people to see Bastion, because I feel like they were going for something. You could learn something about, I don't know, game design there. Whereas in Bastion, I feel like this is a solid intro, something to start with if you wanted to dip your toes into these kinds of games. But I just don't feel like there's a lot to write home about, I guess is a struggle for me, which is why a lot of this parlay has been me just saying that. And I don't mean to be giving empty praise. I hope it doesn't sound insincere that I keep saying they're doing the basics well. I really mean that. I think that's something you can see well in this game, that it sticks to the principle that opportunity cost and understanding of opportunity cost, quality over quantity build options, these things will make even a very simple system much better, will elevate a simple system. And the framing devices of the narrative, having the exposition come while you're playing rather than from stopping you, these things add up and I think make for a system that when we're looking at its pieces like this, yeah, I can feel I'm remembering the kind of meh that I might have felt playing it later in my life. I did replay Bastion once after I played it. It's just still been a long time. And yet it's not like they didn't do a good job. You know what I mean? More of a template for making a game rather than it me being that I want you to see this game that much, I guess is how I feel. Whereas while Transistor and Pyre, I'm not sure I'd recommend making your game a game this way. These are really interesting examples of like this specific thing I kind of want you to see. It's like if it were an art gallery, maybe. It's like Bastion is a good blueprint, but I want to bring you into the room for Transistor and Pyre, even though I wouldn't necessarily recommend using that as an example, for making yours. I don't know. That's weird. And it's a weird way to talk about these things. I also want to say that there's this concept of reviewer brain that I didn't really relate to for a long time, but it's a common YouTube cited thing, and I definitely feel like I'm getting it a little bit myself. I've gotten to the point as a player where I don't really do reviews of games, and even if I were to do like a review of a game's build system, it would kind of be just to introduce it to people. And part of the reason for that is you really shouldn't care what I think about these games. I have a totally not related to humans perspective on this stuff. And so while yeah, I my perspective is I respect Bastion for the way they approached making a game. They didn't try to make something overly flashy as a debut title, especially as a debut title. They made something that sticks to the basics and does them well, and trusted that if they make a game that is well designed, that is just they're trying to make a good game, a solid, good, straightforward, if it doesn't need not to be, game, and that people will like that if they make it is impressive. Like I'm, as a human being, morally impressed by somebody doing that. But I don't. I feel like that's not really part of the review of the game itself. This is just what we're doing in these parlay, I think. But yeah, I find that interesting, and I find myself coming down more defensively on people that are really critical of Pyre for the same reason. It's not my business if people do or don't like the gameplay of these games, but I just feel like they did achieve something. They reached for and achieved a thing. And individual games don't matter as much as that to me. That's just not the perspective of someone reviewing a product. You know what I mean? Because I don't want to review products. And so I've been taking these Supergiant reviews in my own direction, but I have to say, Lordrusty, I have an affinity with the way you've presented them too. It was really easy for me to do this one despite not having come back to the game for a while because you worded it in a similar way as well. You were looking at what was the feel of having played this game, not should you go buy this game right now? You know what I mean? We're not quite doing that as a review. I should have said that at the beginning of the parlay too. But in a way, I feel like these are a very effective form of doing a review of a game for parlay. If people who have parlay frequently want to do more parlay like this, I would say as long as I've played it relatively recently, I would feel comfortable doing it for most games on my list that I've played, like that are in the white category. If the last significant play category is white, I've played it in the last year, basically. I think I would be willing to do this for pretty much any game off the cuff, even if I had not, if it hadn't left as strong an impression on me as Bastion did. This one I've played way longer than a year ago. It's been, maybe almost 10 years. But I remember it really well because it was such a formative game for me, as it seems like it was for Lordrusty. It's certainly for other games, provided I've played them pretty recently, I'd be happy to do this for more of them. I can even be a fun thing to do. I feel like we've landed less on a review and more like a retrospective on the game, but I think that's cool. I don't have anything more to say. I thought this was an interesting one, and I know I can see the next parlay from Lordrusty, and it's kind of like looking back on reviewing a developer as a whole, and I'm very interested to do that one as well. So Lordrusty, looking forward to it, or I hope you'll look forward to it. And folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this one, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you aboard. You can submit whatever you want, of course, and I have some example prompts in a pinned comment in the parlay channel, so you don't even have to come up with a prompt if you don't want to, but you certainly can. And if you wanted to do something like this, look back or do a retrospective on like something on my games spreadsheet, it sounds cool to me. That sounds fun. So I'd love to have you. Folks, I've been Zandy. Looking forward to the next one.